A few years ago, a financial journalist set out to interview hundreds of ordinary people about their money habits. He expected to find some clear pattern. Maybe the financially stable ones were all high earners, or maybe they were obsessive budgeters with color-coded spreadsheets. What he actually found surprised him. The people who seemed the least stressed about money didn't necessarily earn the most. Some had completely ordinary salaries. Teachers, engineers, office managers, nurses, people making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. People who, by every external measure, should have felt the same financial pressure everyone else felt. But when he looked closely at their daily lives, something was different. Their homes were slightly simpler. Their purchases were slower and more deliberate. They upgraded things less often. They kept using perfectly functional items long after most people would have replaced them. They didn't talk much about money either. They weren't following the news about the stock market every morning or stressing about their retirement accounts at dinner. They had a kind of quiet relationship with their finances that was almost hard to describe. None of these behaviors looked dramatic. In fact, most people around them wouldn't even notice. A neighbor would drive past and see a normal house. A coworker would see someone brown bagging lunch and assume they were just being frugal that week. A friend at a dinner party might notice they ordered something modest on the menu, but not think twice about it. But over 10 or 15 years, those quiet choices accumulated into something real. Not lottery-winning wealth, not a yacht, just a steady, growing financial foundation that gave them options. The option to leave a bad job. The option to help a family member. The option to weather a crisis without panic. While many people constantly felt money slipping away despite decent salaries, these individuals moved through life with far less financial friction. And here is what matters. Most of what separated them wasn't income. It was habit. Financial stability, more often than not, isn't built through one big dramatic decision. It's built through dozens of small behaviors repeated every single year until those behaviors become invisible parts of how someone lives. In this video, we're going to spend time with 10 of those habits, not as advice, but as observations. Because once you see these patterns in other people's lives, you start to recognize them everywhere. There's a concept in behavioral economics called lifestyle creep. You've probably felt it without knowing the name. It works like this. Whenever income rises, spending rises to match it almost automatically. A raise arrives, and within months, the apartment gets bigger, the car gets newer, the weekend trips get more expensive. The raise disappears not into savings, but into a slightly elevated version of the same life. Economist and author Morgan Housel writes about this in The Psychology of Money, and he puts it plainly, wealth is what you don't see. The expensive cars, the renovated kitchens, the wardrobe full of new clothes, those are the opposite of wealth. They're wealth that has already been converted into visible things. The people who quietly accumulate financial stability are often invisible precisely because they don't spend their money on looking financially successful. The average American household, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, spends a significant portion of its monthly income on things that weren't part of their budget 5 years earlier. New subscriptions, upgraded services, better versions of things they already had. Not because they needed these upgrades, but because they felt like the natural next step at a higher income. And this is the problem at the center of so many middle-class financial struggles. It isn't that people earn too little, though that is a real issue for many. It's that the gap between what people earn and what they spend never widens. Income rises, and the lifestyle rises to swallow it. The potential for savings that a raise could have created simply doesn't materialize. The people described in that journalist's research had found a way to interrupt this pattern, not through deprivation, not through rigid discipline, but through specific small habits that acted like quiet brakes on the natural pull of lifestyle inflation. Habits that, from the outside, looked almost unremarkable. Let's start with the first one. There's a woman in her early 40s who works as a hospital administrator in a mid-sized city. She's been at her job for 12 years. In that time, she's received several raises. Her salary today is nearly double what it was when she started. And yet her apartment is the same size it was 7 years ago. She moved to a slightly nicer building once, but she didn't upsize. She drives a car she bought used 5 years ago. It runs fine. She has no plans to replace it. What's interesting about her is not that she's cheap. She eats well, she travels a couple of times a year, she has nice things in her home. But she has almost no debt, a growing investment account, and a financial cushion that lets her sleep well at night. And when you ask her about it, she doesn't describe a financial strategy. She just says she doesn't see the point in replacing things that still work. This is the first habit. The quiet practice of running things to their natural end of life, rather than replacing them when they start to feel outdated. James Wallman, who wrote Stuffication, spent years studying how people relate to their possessions. He found that in consumer cultures, people often replace items not because the items have stopped functioning, but because they've started to feel old. The phone that works perfectly but is now 2 models behind. The sofa that's still comfortable but looks dated. The kitchen appliances that do the job but aren't the new stainless steel version. This feeling of outdatedness is manufactured. It's built into product design cycles, advertising, and social comparison. And it costs people an extraordinary amount of money. The hospital administrator doesn't feel this pull the way most people do. Or more accurately, she feels it, but she's developed a quiet resistance to it. She asks herself a single question before any significant purchase. Does what I have actually stop me from doing what I need to do? If the answer is no, she doesn't buy. It's not complicated. But over 12 years, that simple habit has saved her the equivalent of a year's salary. Maybe more. The second habit lives right next to the first one, and it's this. These financially stable people tend to own less overall. Not dramatically less. They're not living in bare rooms with a single chair and a mattress on the floor. But their spaces have fewer things in them than the average person's. And this matters more than it sounds. There's a concept in behavioral research sometimes called the Diderot effect, named after the 18th century philosopher Denis Diderot, who wrote an essay describing how receiving one beautiful new gift, a gorgeous dressing gown, set off a chain of purchases as everything else in his home began to seem shabby by comparison. One new item creates a felt need for new items around it. Owning fewer things interrupts this cycle. When you have less, each purchase doesn't automatically generate pressure for more purchases. The person who owns a modest wardrobe doesn't feel the pull to keep building it the way someone with an overcrowded closet does. The person with a simply furnished apartment isn't constantly noticing what's missing from it. This quiet restraint in ownership is one of the most financially protective habits that almost never gets discussed. Because it doesn't look like financial behavior. It just looks like taste. There's a pattern that comes up repeatedly when you observe how financially stable people shop. They almost never buy things at full price for anything other than groceries or immediate necessities. Not because they're bargain hunters in any active sense. They're not clipping coupons or spending hours comparing prices online. It's simpler than that. They've developed a habit of waiting. A man who teaches high school history in a suburban district has a small rule he follows that his wife calls the 30-day drawer. Whenever he feels the impulse to buy something that isn't immediately necessary, a new piece of equipment for a hobby, a piece of furniture, a piece of clothing, he writes it down on a notepad he keeps in a kitchen drawer. Then he waits 30 days. At the end of 30 days, he looks at the list again. A significant number of items no longer feel necessary. The impulse has passed. The ones that remain on the list after 30 days are the things he actually wants, and he usually finds a way to buy them thoughtfully, often at a better price. He's not denying himself anything. He's just introducing a delay between impulse and action. Behavioral economist Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on how people actually make financial decisions, spent much of his career studying this gap between what people intend to do and what they actually do. His research confirmed something that anyone who has ever bought something impulsively and regretted it already knows intuitively. The system most people use to make purchasing decisions is reactive, emotional, and almost entirely driven by the moment. The way to interrupt that system is not willpower. Willpower fails. The way to interrupt it is friction. Introduce a small delay and many impulse purchases simply dissolve. This is the third habit. Deliberate delay before non-essential purchases. The fourth habit is closely related, and it has to do with how these people think about the true cost of things. Not just the price tag, but what economists sometimes call the opportunity cost. In simple terms, What else could this money do if I didn't spend it here? There's a woman in her late 30s who works in marketing. She earns a solid salary. A few years ago, a friend recommended She Read Your Money or Your Life by Vicki Robin, and something in the book's framing permanently changed how she thought about purchases. Robin asks readers to think about money not as currency, but as stored life energy, the hours of your life you traded to earn it. When you look at a purchase through that lens, a $200 item isn't just $200. It's however many hours of your working life you traded for those $200. The marketing woman doesn't calculate this precisely every time she shops. But the mental model changed something in her. She started naturally asking herself whether things were worth the hours of her life they represented. And she found that many things weren't. Not because she was being dramatic about it, just because when she held the object in her mind against the hours required to earn it, the transaction often didn't seem worth it. This habit of mentally converting prices into time doesn't slow her life down or make shopping an anxious experience. It just filters it. She buys fewer things, but she feels better about what she buys. And over several years, that quiet filter has created a meaningfully different financial picture for her. One of the quietest habits of financially stable people is something that barely registers as a financial behavior at all. It's this: they find pleasure in things that cost very little. This isn't asceticism. It isn't a philosophy. It's more like a skill that some people develop and others don't. The skill of building a daily life that generates genuine satisfaction from sources that aren't expensive. Cooking a good meal at home and actually enjoying the process. Long walks in neighborhoods or parks. Reading. Gardening. Home projects. Social evenings with friends that don't happen at expensive restaurants. The psychologist Tim Kaiser spent decades studying the relationship between materialistic values and well-being. His research, detailed in The High Price of Materialism, found consistently that people who placed high importance on acquiring possessions and wealth reported lower levels of daily well-being than people who prioritized experiences, relationships, and non-material pleasures. The counterintuitive part is that this wasn't about income. It was about orientation, what someone genuinely enjoyed and found meaningful. The people who seem quietly financially stable often have, without necessarily thinking about it in these terms, built a life where their sources of daily pleasure don't require much spending. A Friday evening at home with good food and a film they've wanted to watch feels genuinely satisfying to them. A Saturday morning walk doesn't feel like settling for something cheaper. It feels like what they actually want. This is the fifth habit. The cultivation of low-cost pleasures as genuine sources of enjoyment, not as substitutes for something better. The sixth habit is less philosophical and more practical, but it connects. It has to do with social spending, the money people spend not because they want to, but because a social context seems to require it. There's a quiet but enormous category of spending that almost never gets examined in personal finance discussions because it's socially invisible. The rounds of drinks bought at a bar to keep up with the group. The restaurant chosen because it's where everyone else is going, not because the price works for you. The vacation taken because everyone in a friend group is going on similar vacations. The gifts purchased at a price that matches what others in the group spend. James Clear writes in Atomic Habits about how behavior is shaped by social environment, often far more powerfully than by individual intention. The norms of a group become the default behavior of its members. If you belong to a social group where dining out frequently at expensive restaurants is normal, that becomes your normal too, regardless of whether it fits your finances. The financially stable people in the journalist's research had, over time, built social lives that weren't organized around expensive spending. Not because they'd isolated themselves, but because they'd developed relationships where the social activity didn't primarily revolve around consuming things. Or they developed a quiet comfort with opting out of the expensive version of a social activity while staying connected in other ways. This isn't easy. Social pressure around spending is genuinely powerful. But it's one of the most financially consequential areas of everyday life, and the people who figure out how to navigate it without damaging their relationships tend to come out significantly ahead. The seventh habit is one that shows up most clearly in how people handle their fixed monthly expenses, the bills, subscriptions, and services they pay for every month without really thinking about them. There's an engineer in his mid-30s who does an annual review every January. Not his finances in some broad sense, just his monthly subscriptions and recurring bills. He goes through every automatic payment that leaves his account every month and asks a single question. Did I use this enough this year to justify the cost next year? If the answer is no, he cancels. Not because the individual item is catastrophically expensive, but because he's noticed how subscriptions accumulate invisibly. Research from consumer finance tracking companies has found, consistently, that most people significantly underestimate how many subscriptions they're paying for and significantly underestimate the total monthly cost. Subscriptions are designed to be forgettable. They're small enough individually that they don't trigger scrutiny. But they layer. A streaming service here, a software subscription there, a gym membership that gets used inconsistently, a meal kit service that slowed down but was never canceled. The aggregate cost is often startling when someone actually adds it up. The engineer's annual review is one of the most return-on-time invested financial habits you'll encounter. He spends maybe 2 hours once a year doing it. And every year without fail, he cancels things he forgot he was paying for. Over 10 years, he estimates this habit has saved him more than $5,000. Not from any single cancellation, just from the accumulated small ones. This is the 7th habit. Treating recurring expenses as contracts that require annual renewal of consent, rather than defaults that continue unless actively stopped. The 8th habit is about home and housing, one of the largest financial decisions in most people's lives. The people who maintain quiet financial stability over long periods tend to resist the pull toward bigger homes. Not because they don't appreciate space, but because they've noticed something that behavioral economists call hedonic adaptation. The phenomenon where whatever you have quickly becomes the baseline, and the pleasure from an upgrade fades within months. A couple in their early 40s bought a modest 3-bedroom home when they had their first child. Their income has grown considerably since then. By every social expectation in their neighborhood, they should have moved to something larger by now, more bedrooms, bigger yard, finished basement. But they haven't. Their home is paid for, essentially. Their mortgage is tiny relative to their income. And the money that would have gone into housing costs has quietly flowed into other parts of their financial life. When their friends ask why they haven't moved to something bigger, they find it hard to explain. Not because they don't have a reason, but because the reason doesn't fit into a normal conversation about real estate. The truth is they've noticed that every friend who moved into a bigger home almost immediately stopped noticing the bigness of it. Within a year, it was just the house. The excitement faded, but the larger mortgage payment didn't. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman's research on hedonic adaptation suggests this isn't personal weakness, it's a fundamental feature of human psychology. We adapt to better circumstances faster than we expect to. The implication for housing is significant. The upgrade rarely delivers the sustained increase in daily satisfaction that people anticipate when they're making the decision. But the cost is permanent. The couple staying in the modest house isn't making a sacrifice. Or at least it doesn't feel like one to them. They've just internalized something about how lasting satisfaction is actually built, and housing has never made much of a dent in it. The 9th habit is about how these financially stable people relate to financial windfalls, bonuses, tax refunds, an unexpected inheritance, a gift, money that arrives outside the normal income stream. The pattern is consistent and quietly powerful. They don't change their lifestyle in response to it. Not because they're joyless about extra money, but because they've developed what might be called a windfall protocol. The money goes somewhere specific before it can disappear into the general spending stream. A woman who works in local government received a modest inheritance a few years ago after her grandmother passed away. It was enough money to be meaningful, but not enough to transform her life. And the people around her had opinions about what she should do with it. Upgrade the car. Take a real vacation. Renovate the kitchen. These were genuine, well-meaning suggestions from people who cared about her. Instead, she put the entire amount into an index fund and didn't touch it. She didn't announce this. She didn't make it a statement. She just did it quietly, kept living her normal life, and moved on. The reason this habit is so powerful comes down to what happens when people don't have such a protocol. Research from lottery winners, tax refund recipients, and bonus earners consistently shows that unplanned money tends to evaporate within weeks or months into lifestyle upgrades, impulse purchases, and elevated spending that then becomes the new normal. The money arrives as an opportunity and leaves as a slightly bigger cable package. The woman's decision wasn't dramatic, but over 10 or 15 years, the compound growth on that money will represent something genuinely significant in her financial life. Not because she's brilliant at investing, just because she had a quiet rule about where unexpected money goes. This connects to something Morgan Housel writes about in The Psychology of Money, that the most important financial skill isn't knowing which stocks to pick or how to optimize a tax strategy. It's being able to leave money alone long enough for time to work on it. The people who can do that, who have built a life where they don't feel a compulsive pull to convert financial progress into visible consumption, are the ones who accumulate quietly and steadily over decades. The 10th habit is the one that ties all the others together, and it's perhaps the most invisible of all. It has to do with identity. The financially stable people described throughout this video don't think of their habits as sacrifice. They don't feel like they're denying themselves things. They've built an identity, whether consciously or not, that isn't organized around consumption. When they imagine a good life, the image they see in their minds doesn't primarily feature expensive things. It features experiences, relationships, time, and a sense of security. The material aspects of that image are almost incidental. This is not virtue. And it's not some mysterious quality that some people are born with. It develops, usually gradually, through small experiences that build on each other. Through reading something that reframes how you think about money. Through watching someone you respect live with less and seem genuinely content. Through one or two decisions to delay a purchase that turned out fine, and then another and another, until the habit is just part of how you operate. James Clear's central argument in Atomic Habits is that behavior change that lasts comes from identity change, not motivation. The person who keeps the gym habit doesn't succeed through discipline. They succeed because they've become someone who exercises. The person who maintains financial habits over long periods doesn't succeed because they're perpetually self-denying. They succeed because the habits have become part of how they see themselves, not restrictions imposed on them. The financially stable people who appear throughout this video aren't fighting their instincts every day. They've just, over time, updated what their instincts reach for. What's worth sitting with at the end of all of this is how unremarkable these habits look from the outside. You wouldn't notice them at a dinner party. You wouldn't see them in someone's house. You wouldn't detect them in conversation. There's no signal, no obvious marker, nothing that announces that this person has been quietly doing 10 small things for 15 years that have added up to a fundamentally different financial life. And that invisibility is part of why these habits are so rarely discussed and so rarely imitated. We tend to learn from visible examples. We see the person who made a dramatic investment. We hear about the salary negotiation that changed everything. We notice the person who inherited money or started a business that took off. These stories are visible and easy to tell. The person who just never replaced things until they stopped working and waited 30 days before buying things and kept their home modest and never let their subscriptions accumulate unchecked, that person doesn't have a story that's easy to tell at dinner. Their financial stability is structural, built into how they live, invisible precisely because it works. Morgan Housel writes, near the end of The Psychology of Money, that financial success is not a hard science. It is a soft skill, he says, where how you behave is more important than what you know. That distinction is the whole point of this video. The habits described here don't require financial knowledge. They require a certain way of seeing the world and a certain way of living in it. You've probably seen people like this. Maybe you're thinking of someone right now. A coworker who never seems worried about money. A relative who somehow always has options. A neighbor who has lived in the same modest house for 20 years and seems genuinely fine with it. They probably weren't following a system. They probably couldn't explain exactly how they got where they are financially. But if you watch them closely for long enough, you'd see the habits. Quiet, unremarkable, repeated over thousands of ordinary days, and slowly building something real.